Hi, we continue in Genesis 34. After Hamor and Shechem have made their initial offer to Jacob and his sons, and Jacob's sons have responded with a counteroffer, and now Hamor and Shechem have to try to sell the counteroffer to the people we'll see who are described as the people, the men of the city who are at the gate of the city. And we'll look at that little image today, and we'll look at it even more next time as it makes a key element of the story more clear than we might otherwise understand. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been following the entire Jacob story, and we're down here near the bottom here. If you haven't watched the introductory video to this unit of Genesis 34 to 36, I encourage you to do so, where we go over some of these issues that I've been going over a little bit as we go, but I go over the whole question of how scholars come at this and some other things in that introductory video. Today we've been going through some of these, and I'd like to look today at how we evaluate the brothers' deceitful counteroffer, the question of marriage of the Canaanites, which I've hit on, but I'll mention again today, and the question of the land and the role of Shechem as a place rather than as the person in the story. We'll look at the closing exchange next time when we look at the end of the story. So let's first look at Shechem. We looked at this in the introductory video, but just to give us some context here. And scholars like Baruch Halpern, who combine with skills I don't have to be both a good literary critic of the text itself, but also a field archaeologist, explores the historical connection around Shechem between the Judges passage, the Kings passage, and what we see in our Genesis passage today, as well as what we see in all these. I didn't put Genesis 34 up here, 34 up here, because it's obviously the one we're working on. And when we look at it just briefly, we see there are quite a number of what might seem like conflicting messages here. So we saw right at the beginning of the Abram cycle, before he was Abraham, he passed through the land to a place at Shechem where Yahweh appeared to him. So in that sense, Shechem was already a place where Yahweh could appear. And then later, after this, we'll see Joseph's brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. But in the Joshua situation, we see that Shechem had been set up as a sanctuary city, and Joshua gathered all the tribes there at the end of the book of Joshua before they cross over the river to see if they would covenant at that point to worship Yahweh. And at the end of that chapter, the place is sacralized by noting that the bones of Joseph are buried there. Connecting with the Genesis story later in the section that we'll see after Genesis 37. But in the Judges story, we see a much longer story of Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem to his mother's kinfolk and asked about the question of rule. Notice in this situation, in the Joshua situation, and in the ones that follow about Rehoboam, son of Solomon, and Jeroboam, the king, the man who became the king of the separate nation of Israel after they rebelled from the reign of Solomon's son Rehoboam, all are around the question of leadership. So Joshua here is the leader, but plainly the question is Yahweh the leader who you're going to worship? And then here the question is Rehoboam going to Shechem to be made king, and Jeroboam rebuilding Shechem there as part of his capital city, and to connect it with Penuel, which we saw in Genesis 28, was the place where Jacob said, God was in this place and I didn't know it. There's an awful lot of evidence here that Shechem was a sacred place to the Israelites, and yet in this story, it's occupied by Hivites until the end of the story, when it's not. And so perhaps this story with its ending sets up the possibility of Shechem being an open place that Israelites can take, no longer occupied by Hivites. But some of this is beyond the scope of what we're going to do today. So as we look at our section in terms of structure, we're looking at this chiasm right here, which is a very nice, tight chiasm. So verse 20, you see, says, Hamor and his son Shechem came to the gate of the city and spoke to the men of their city. City mentioned twice. And at the end, it highlights the gate of the city again, also mentioned twice. Then in the B parts, there's the proposal here about exchanging daughters. On the flip side, it's about the other parts, the livestock and animals. And in the middle is the condition, which they have to run over quickly lest they think about it too much and focus on the framing of the good things they think they'll get, daughters and other people's livestock and property. So we'll see how they rhetorically put that in there. We've also been looking at how this chapter provides links to all the earlier parts of Genesis and even to some parts after, highlighting that near the end of the Jacob cycle here, it's bringing forward some of the themes we've seen throughout. So in our section here, we can see the issue of the gate of the city connected with Sodom, and also with the more friendly story of Abraham negotiating for the burial place for Sarah with Ephraim the Hittite there in that city. We also hear the issue issue of becoming one people, echoing from the Babel story, where it was obviously a negative element there because it was one people away from God, and yet that's also what's happening here because God isn't mentioned. Dinah's brothers take their swords, echoing the only other swords, which is the sword of Esau there, and mentioned another time. And then we'll look at this next time. So continuing to provide many links there. And what I want to show now, and this is something that Sternberg doesn't do, but it's the kind of thing that Sternberg does in other parts of Genesis, which is to compare how things are narrated and how they're retold. Sometimes it's by the narrator and someone else, and sometimes it's by a character. As we saw in chapter 24, when Abraham's servant met Rebekah at the well, and we heard how it went there, and then we heard how he retold it to Laban later, framing it for his own rhetorical purposes. And we'll see the same thing here. So before we go over our section that you can see on the left side in detail, let's just look at the color-coded parts, and we can see what is carried over and what's not. So in the initial proposal was to make marriages and exchange daughters, and we see that Jacob's sons are willing to do that, and then that's repeated to the people of the city. The issue of settling is in all three. The proposal to settle, we will settle, and on this condition they will settle. Trade comes up in the offer here and in the in the repeat of the proposal, but Jacob's sons don't mention the issue of trade at all there. And this issue of the land being open is not mentioned at all, and getting property is not mentioned. Similarly, Jacob's sons make the condition, if you will not listen to us and be circumcised, we will take our daughter and be gone, and that's not repeated. What is added here to sweeten the deal is to highlight the land is large enough for them, so it's not a matter of squeezing them in. What exact land they're referring to is hard to know. If it's a city, as it's stated to be, it almost certainly has a wall, in which case that's a limited amount of space. But the field that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor that we saw at the end of chapter 33 suggests obviously there's agricultural land outside the city where agricultural land would be, whether it's to grow crops or to have animals, as is the indication here, since Jacob's family are not agriculturalists but pastoralists. And so they add that. But then they add this little trick here, and we'll look at our notes to see how scholars engage in that. Will not their livestock, their property, and all their animals be ours? Which is not anything about what Jacob's sons would agree, that they would be giving up their livestock and their property and all their animals. It was much more a matter of sharing. So that's how the counterproposal is stated there. So let's put our keywords up, and we can see how the keywords work, and we'll go through our passage here. And that note just shows the chiasm. So Hamor and his son Shechem came to the gate of their city, which helps us to realize we don't know where the previous scene took place. Jacob had bought land and a field, and he had a tent pitched there in front of the city. And we'd heard earlier that as he waited while his sons came in from the field. So if they're coming in from the field, they're obviously not in the field where that's happening, but we don't know otherwise where that was. So at this point, it seems like Hamor and his son Shechem are leaving where Jacob and his sons are, certainly to have a private conversation with their own people, and came to the gate of their city. As I noted, just in the comparison with earlier in Genesis, we've seen gate of the city in Sodom and these other places. But this is a different situation than we see in Genesis 23, and we'll see more about that next time. I'm not going to highlight that now. We'll look at that more when we look at verse 25. But there's Schmutzer's 2007 article, which I found very helpful around the question of who these people are, notes. He says below, the pivotal role of the gate made its location prominent for both king and merchant, but also the most vulnerable point of a city's defense system under military attack, since the gate already constituted a structural breach in the wall. And so he's going to highlight something that we'll see in verse 25 or 24, which I'll note right now, but we'll see it how it plays on the other side of the chiasm, which is not named here, all who went out of the gate of his city. So we'll keep that in mind. We'll come back to that. So he spoke to the men of their city here. Where the women are, we don't know. And is this all the men? At this point, it seemed to suggest all the men of the city. Notice that city is twice in the verse and repeated in short order in 25, 27, 28, highlighting the urban context. And I want to highlight just one more time that against scholars who see this as about the inability or the prohibition to intermarry with foreigners, according to texts like Deuteronomy 7 or Ezra and Nehemiah. This text makes very clear, as I've been saying, it has nothing to do with that at all, but it has to do with the question of the sister being defiled, as we see that theme repeated in the red underlined sections throughout here. So that's the issue, that these are people of the city who do these kinds of things. It's not that they're Hivites as much as it's only mentioned once at the very beginning, but city, which is mentioned all these times, as I just noted. So as they come, they make this proposal. And I think for this purpose, I'll leave this up so you can see what they say and what they didn't say. So as my note below says from Turner, if the elders had known, if these are elders, as we'll look at a little later, would they have suggested caution, being more awake to possible reprisals than the more emotionally involved father and son? But that's a question that Turner asks, not using Schmutzer's insight that we'll look at in a moment. So these people, literally these men, they're not people here, they're only people in this word here in verse 22. So these men, parallel to the men of their city, are friendly with us, using shalemim here, similar to the word we saw in 33:18, that could either have been the name of a sub-geographic area, Shalem of Shechem, or came safely to Shechem, a word that has something to do with security, related to shalom, but not quite. So that's why we get the translation friendly here. But as Turner notes again below, a deep dramatic irony given both the contrast with the initial experience at 33:18, which I was just noting, and at the actual outcome of the encounter, which will be anything but friendly or secure. And we'll hear how that image of security in another word comes out here in the word badly translated unawares here in verse 25, again, that we'll look at next time. So let them live. Every time it says live, it really means settle, and I highlighted that in the key words here every time. Let them settle with us. And I want to highlight that because, as we'll see when we get to chapter 35, when God comes to Jacob and tells him to go settle in Bethel, the whole issue in this chapter is that Jacob settled too soon. And I go over that more in the introductory video, but I really want to highlight that because if we're focused on the moral relativity of the rape versus what the sons are going to do and their deception here, we're missing the point that there are only bad choices here, because the first bad choice of settling in front of the city led to only bad choices. And that's why Jacob will have to do what he was supposed to do in the first place when the story is over, which is settle away from these city people. So let them live in the land. Again, I'll put the proposal back up in comparison so we can see, and trade in it, as we noted in 31:10 earlier, but it's not mentioned by Jacob's sons. For the land is large enough here. Literally, behold wide-handed, as Westerman helpfully notes, imagines that the arms are stretched out on both sides to indicate the extent of the land. So given the two premises that the people are friendly to us, in other words, they're not going to come upon us and do what they're actually going to do, and they're not going to squeeze us out because there's plenty of room, therefore, let us take their daughters in marriage and let us give them our daughters. Note that we saw last time the little bit of deception here in verse 16 when the sons of Jacob say, we will give our daughters to you, and we know, but these people in the story don't know, that they don't have any other daughters, that the Hivites have the only daughter the Jacob people have already in their possession. And we'll see in verse 26 next time the evidence for that. So let's take their daughters in marriage and give their daughters, then only on this condition, echoing exactly what was said, only on this condition that we saw here in the red, will they agree to live among us or settle among us, exactly the same, the premise exactly the same, that every male among us be circumcised as they are circumcised. Again, verbatim, they're doing a good job there. And as I noted last time, every male could suggest the animals, because the word for male here is not the same as the word we hear here and here for men, anashim. And so it could mean that, but certainly they understand it just as the proposal understood it, as just being about the people, to become one people. And that one people, again, is echoing what we saw here in verse 16 here, one people. So then they add this little thing at the end. Will not their livestock, their property, and all their animals? And livestock and animals are similar, of course, and it's highlighting not just certain kinds of cattle, but everything. Will not everything they have be ours? And they might not know about the daughters, but they can certainly know about the livestock, although we saw earlier that in the earlier chapters 32 and 33 that Jacob prepared to give a lot of his animals as presents to his brother Esau, but in fact we never saw that Esau took any of those animals as presents. So does Jacob still have all the livestock and animals he had in the first place, or did Esau take them? We have to assume he has them here, or they wouldn't. These people would not be famishing, desiring them. So only let us agree with them, as we noted earlier, is a word used for sign. So again, verbatim repetition here. So they added this thing there, and otherwise noted it verbatim, as we see. And it's interesting that the people of the city have no speaking part. the text really focuses on the father and son in both situations, although Jacob's sons had speaking part, Shechem has a speaking part. But the rest of Jacob's people, including Dinah and Rachel and Leah and all the others, have no speaking part, nor do the other sons, and neither do any of these people here. So we just get the narrator summary. And this is where we get to what Schmutzer is really trying to help us here. As my note below has, the Hebrew word order makes tighter the focus around come out of the city gate, framing around every male was circumcised. So many scholars note that the phrase, all who went out of the city gate, is repeated in the same verse. Why does that need to happen? And this note is to say there's a little ABA chiasm here, that Hamor and his son Shechem and every male was circumcised is in the midst of all who went out of the city gate. And this is the phrase we need to really look at here. And Schmutzer notes, as you can see below, argues against elders, as I noted Turner has it, or citizens as others have it, in favor of a military collocation view. He notes that the term to go out of the city, in contrast to what we would see in the story in chapter 23, when it said that Abraham went to all the people who went into the city, that going out of the city used 120 times in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew language text, for going out to battle, as it is 200 times in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Further, he argues that his city, which is what the grammatical detail of city is, although Northey just says the city, refers to each male who will be circumcised in contrast with their city. So his, meaning distributed across all the people, his city, as I could say my city or your city about whatever city we would live in common, even though it's not the city we own, it's the city we live in. But the issue of going out of the city gate, that's the issue that Schmutzer really is highlighting here, and that's the important part, because of what we're hearing there is that this is the military people. It's not just all the people of the city, although that's what it sounds like here. It doesn't say all up here. And here it has the word call for all 3 times in a rhythm that's lost in the Hebrew. All who went out of the city, all the males were circumcised, all who went out of the gate of the city. So emphasizing the all here, but not all the citizens, all who went out of the gate, highlighting it's the military people there. And as Schmutzer notes in the repetition here, the narrator's verbatim use of the same idiom following notice of collective circumcision sounds a moral alarm for the reader and a funeral dirge for the men. What I'd like to highlight, too, that Schmutzer doesn't connect, is that this is connected to what we saw at the end of chapter 33 around Jacob pitching his tent in the face of the city. Let's go back and look at that for a moment. So as we saw up here, the phrase for camped before the city, or literally in the face of the city, is highlighting a phrase, as we saw in 2 Samuel, for a military position. So when we take account of the fact that Jacob had camped before the city, echoing other passages where people are doing that for the purpose of invading the city. And then we look at it in light of what we see down here about the military people of the city. We see this was set up for battle all along. And perhaps that's just another thematic element of that echoes the David story, that although the story seems to be about a pastoral man with no kind of army at all against the people of the city, as we're going to see, Simeon and Levi have swords, and they have certainly plenty of military prowess when they take advantage of the circumcision trick that they're just setting up for people. And so it's really a military battle is signaled here, but in contrast with the David story, where they set up, or in the conquest story, in Joshua and in Numbers, where it's purposely going in to be military, here Jacob has found himself, unfortunately, in a military situation, which, as we'll see next time, will make his name stink to the people all around. And we'll see how that plays out next time. See you then. Bye-bye.